What is up, guys? Welcome back to Think Shank. Today we are continuing the summer break take series, diving into the Western Conference representative at the NBA Finals last year, the Dallas Mavericks. Incredible story and incredible run in overall performance, given some of the roster changes. And I just have a few things that really stuck out to me, even including off of the court. So very excited to jump into this team today. In classic fashion, we're going to attack it the same way. So looking at last year's regular season, they finished with 50 wins with a net differential plus 2.6, leaves them 12th in the league, offensive rating of 8th at 118, and defensive rating of 17th. Biggest things I want to call out there, 50 wins even with Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic combining for missing around 25 games. That is still very impressive. I also want to call out the defensive rating specifically is a little misleading, as we'll get into come playoffs. At the trade deadline, of course, they pick up PJ Washington, their starting power forward, and then Daniel Gafford from the Wizards as their starting center. Both guys without a lick of playoff experience, coming over mid-season, and they actually closed out the regular season with the best defense in the entire NBA. Of course, that last little tail bit of the regular season is always funky, with some teams tanking and other teams resting their stars and things like that. But it was near optimal when you think about it from an indicator perspective, and most importantly, seemed to translate pretty well come the playoffs. So looking at the playoffs now, they finish 13-9 overall, playing 22 full playoff games. Again, PJ Washington and Gafford without any experience there. Huge deal. Net differential, they had the 5th best of all 20 playoff or play-in NBA teams at 3.6. Offensive rating was 9th at 115. Defense 6th at 111. Pumping the brakes quickly, it's very easy to see the 5th best net differential and really be enamored there. I think it's, again, a very helpful indicator, but particularly in that Clippers series as well as Minnesota, definitely saw some blowouts that are going to help that overall. And of course, we're going to double click into what some of those specific drivers were. But again, incredible overall. Again, with the defensive rating, important to call out here, having the 6th best defense of all playoff and play-in teams, finishing at 17th in defensive rating for the entire regular season. Again, just a testament to the incredible potency and proficiency of PJ Washington, Daniel Gafford, running around, guarding the other team's power forwards, as well as the rim, and especially important when we think about what kind of teams they were going up against with that PJ Washington power forward position, particularly, and where they had him guarding. Looking at it now, round by round, against Boston, they lose in 5 games. It was a pretty good waxing overall, of course, by the time they got to the actual finals there. I think there were a lot of drivers, playoff experience, spotlight. Of course, Boston infamously getting the red carpet, or I guess green carpet maybe, to the NBA Finals with all the injuries. And I think in general their matchups were about as perfectly scripted and manicured as you could want it if you're Missoula or Brad Stevens. They finish with only a minus 3-point differential, though, offensive rating of 108, defensive rating of 111. About what they had been averaging previously as far as defensive rating goes, which I think is really important, and I think ultimately why, as we'll get into, the offense became their Achilles heel. Their offense, though, as you can see by the indicator, 108 offensive rating. They average 115 for the whole playoffs, and then even in the regular season, they're 118. So a pretty stark drop-off there, setting the stage for more discussion down the line. Minnesota's interesting. They win 4-1, 6.8 point differential, greater than their average, of course, at 3.6. They finish with a 119 offensive rating and 113 defensive rating. So slightly a little bit higher defensively, giving up more points, but absolutely scoring the ball at a much, much better clip against Minnesota than Boston. Maybe not quite as you would imagine it, given Minnesota's impressive defensive stature all season and playoffs, particularly in their earlier series. We'll get into that as well. Oklahoma City, second round, they win in 6 games. Famously, it was a 0.5 point differential. Again, this is coming from Cleaning the Glass, so they cut garbage time and stuff. They finished with a 0.5 point differential, offensive rating of 114, defensive rating of 113. Biggest punchline and takeaway there, Oklahoma City and Boston, as I'll get into, they were the best equipped for Dallas's outside-in offensive scheme. And as you can see here, again, it was only a 6-game series, but Oklahoma City was right there with them with its incredible perimeter defensive potency, a bunch of guys to throw on Luka and Kyrie, J-Dub, Lou Dort, Cason Wallace, even Shea, being disruptive in passing lanes, all of that kind of stuff. Pretty much even offensive defense, nothing's too remarkable there. But those were rather pretty evenly matched teams, and I think a lot of people, maybe due to Oklahoma City's inexperience and youth and all of that thing, the fact that the Mavs made it out of there in just 6 games, I think a lot of folks will just kind of write off in their heads as, yeah, that should probably have happened. It makes sense. Luka and Kyrie have just way too much playoff experience, and they're just going to be better than this, team where the average age is like 22 years old. Almost the exact same point differential, and again, the actual scheme clash was very, very real and very successful on Oklahoma City's side. So I'll get into that. The Clippers, of course, Kawhi playing 1.5 games, essentially didn't really stand a chance overall. I know the series went 6 games. Dallas's point differential was plus 9.2. Anytime you have a point differential in a playoff series, kind of around that mark, that's probably the beginning of a air quote kind of blowout-y series. They really hammered him. So offensive rating of 117, defensive rating of only 108. Without Kawhi, the Clippers obviously crumbled quite a bit, particularly offensively. And when you think about the matchups, Kawhi usually playing the 4, matching up with PJ Washington or Luka, it is just going to be really difficult. Of course, Kawhi is incredibly potent when healthy on both sides of the ball. Playing the Dallas Mavericks is essentially a signal that having an incredible perimeter, mid-range, point-of-attack defender is not a question. It is an absolute necessity, and the Clippers just did not have it in the bag in that sense. I think offensively as well, PG, Harden being that 1-2 option against a team as hungry, experienced, talented, well-constructed as the Mavericks, it was just going to be tough, and that's ultimately why you see a pretty big point differential there. Moving over to playoff indicators and roster, we have, of course, Luka Doncic, Kyrie Irving, Derek Jones Jr., PJ Washington, Daniel Gafford. Notable names coming off of the bench in a regular rotation, Maxi Kleber, once he was able to come back and be healthy. Remember, he had that injury earlier in the playoff run, was able to come back a little bit in the finals. Really did not seem like his former self, particularly on the offensive end. Very, very hesitant to put up shots, feel confident scoring, and that became an issue. The headline maker here, of course, is going to be Derek Lively, first-year player, rookie out of Duke, 7'1", extremely coordinated, athletic for a guy of his stature, and really fit just like a glove in this Mavericks system with its 2-prong guard piloted offensive scheme. Incredible rim runner and just as incredible defender. And notice I'm being intentional there, calling out rim defense versus everything else. This guy frankly seems like he has the ability to effectively guard 2 through 5, more or less. We saw flashes of him guarding in space in that Minnesota series. Obviously, that isn't ideal, but he just seems to have an incredible, again, body control and physical tools, great instincts on rim protection, even with things like not fouling too much, which, of course, you'll notice with a lot of these rookie, young, inexperienced centers. Really impressed me in that sense. I thought that was going to be a big part of the game plan for Minnesota, for example, with Karl Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert, things like that. But he really held his ground really well. We also saw for very, very short stints, Josh Green come in. One of my honestly favorite under-the-radar players. He honestly feels super similar to Quentin Grimes to me, funny enough. Just similar tenacity and effort and motor on the floor as a defender. I don't know if it perfectly balances or reflects some of his defensive metrics, but effort is really there. And then on the offensive end, when they were deep, of course, in that Dallas series, he was the only guy really making any shots throughout it. Even in their one win against Boston, it was a large part in credit due to him being able to find and hit his outside shots. Unfortunately, overall, it really wasn't that consistent. And I think in general, the issue with Green comes down to his defensive deficiencies with some of the size, some of the kind of overzealousness, things like that. But overall, it's one of those kind of spark plug guys that I personally like having on this roster, and a big reason why I think them pretty much stealing Grimes from Detroit is a really big deal. Next, let's take a look at some of the key indicators for them in the playoffs. On the offensive end of the floor, like I said before, 9th best offensive rating at 115 points per possession, 5th best effective field goal percentage, 54%, 15th in turnover percentage at 14%, offensive rebounding, 7th at 29%, free throw rate, 10th at 19.7, 20 free throw attempts per 100 possessions. Defensively, you have them finishing 6th in defensive rating at 111, effective field goal 4th at 52%, turnover percentage 8th at 13%, offensive rebounding 7th at 27%, and then free throw rate at 13th, giving up to the other teams about 19 free throw attempts per 100 possessions. The synthesis and analysis there, I think I want to start with offense here. Number one, again, in aggregate, obviously this includes, for a finals team, this includes 4 playoff rounds. So Clippers, Thunder, Wolves, Celtics. To finish with the 5th best offensive effective field goal percentage is really, really impressive to me, particularly when you just kind of casually reflect on how difficult it seemed sometimes for them to hit shots and generate quality open ones. That's a joke. The second part of it is mainly coming from your Derrick Jones Jr.'s and PJ Washington's very streaky shooting, which I'll double click on, but kind of just surprised me that they finished 5th out of 20 playoff/play-in teams in terms of effective field goal percentage. I have to think that's ultimately a credit to primarily Luka's scoring, as well as initiating or facilitating skills, getting open looks, and helping guys make shots. But as we all know, making very, very difficult shots as well. The turnover percentage is, I think, where we probably think about, or at least I was probably misplacing in my memories in relation to the effective field goal percentage being so high. The turnover percentage being pretty bad for them on offense is probably where I'm getting at. So again, you think about who they had to go through, which I'll elaborate on, but going through the Clippers, kind of just cover that with your hand, okay. But the Thunder, into the Wolves, into the Celtics, those are probably literally the 3 best defensive teams in the entire NBA outside of, I guess, the Orlandos and maybe Cleveland's. But just think about that. Oklahoma City and Boston, very, very similar when you think about, defensive infrastructures and strengths and roster abilities. Great. It's very perimeter oriented, and they're just going to have more pressure and just more ability to disrupt some of Luka's playmaking, as well as just simply getting downhill out of your pick and roll initiations. A lot of guys very, very proficient reading passing lanes, anticipating passes, coming out of the weak side very quickly. Again, your undersized guards with Oklahoma City, I covered them a lot. That was a lot of the reason they were able to generate so many turnovers. They're just very, very small. The level of physicality with undersized guards, I do think works in their favor. I don't think it's an incredibly miraculous, extensive advantage or anything like that. But I genuinely do think it does help with some of the physicality to rip and run balls and get out on the floor on the fast break. Basically, I'm just not that surprised that their turnover percentage would have been higher in a nutshell. But I don't think it's just fair to only talk about it in the context of their opponents. I think that their actual offensive scheme and approach does bear some burden for driving some of those turnovers, which I will get to. And then looking then at the defense, again, another reminder of the defensive potency of this Mavericks team. Again, even through the lens of their opponents, Oklahoma City and Boston specifically, while very well equipped to thwart Dallas's offensive modes of attack, very, very good job, obviously, overall, in limiting their offensive potency on Dallas's end, even when you think about the 5-out infrastructures that they were going against, with Chet spacing. Porzingis obviously came in and played for only a little bit, but obviously was very effective in those stretches. But you bring in Al Horford, etc., Jalen Williams off the bench for OKC, you're still putting up very, very sound defensive numbers, even by playoff standards, with a traditional air quote big, Lively Gafford, having them spaced out. And I really think that's a testament to Dallas doing a good job at doing the balancing act between rim running bigs who are more traditional and are going to prefer protecting the basket against these 5-out schemes like a Celtics or Thunder team where they have Chet, Porzingis, Al Horford, whoever, stretching them out. The balancing act is not allowing these spaced out bigs to get wide open threes and be able to burn you that way, but also to protect when that space is trying to be leveraged by your Jason Tatums, Jalen Williams, SGA, whoever, by getting downhill quickly and to the basket for easier lay-ins, because obviously the rim protector is going to have to come over and try to provide some help. Basically, having such a good defensive rating against these 5-out teams is very, very impressive considering these traditional bigs that they had, and especially Derek Lively. And then, of course, related to that, being 4th overall in effective field goal percentage for opponents is just great. Just another symptom of that. What I do want to highlight then next, and this is related to the defense things, is the starter differentials on-off that Dallas had with Gafford versus Lively throughout the playoffs last year. Overall, the Mavericks had a minus 0.3 on-off differential with Gafford on the floor, with an offensive rating of 112.1, defensive rating 112.4. Great, makes sense. But the differential when Derek Lively was on the floor for this Mavericks team, that differential ballooned to plus 17.2 points per possession, offensive rating of 120, defensive rating of 102. Gafford in, it was 446, Derek Lively 286. Again, mind you, this is cleaning the glass, so they're going to cut out your garbage time stats. So these are fruitful possessions that actually matter and are meaningful for the game. Derek Lively had a plus 17.2 point differential overall when he was on the floor in that starting unit. Luka, Kyrie, Derek Jones, PJ Washington, and then Lively. You just substitute in Daniel Gafford, and you are left with a minus 0.3 offensive rating there. By far, the biggest driver of that huge differential leap is defense, which I don't think a lot of people would maybe automatically assume, probably in part due to Gafford's play style just being very loud. Like, he has crazy sick blocks and dunks and finishes and screams after he does these things, and it's awesome. But I think assessing this a little more scholarly, it's very, very interesting to me. The defensive rating, right, it goes from 112.4 with Gafford to 102.4 with Lively. And again, we are only talking about Gafford and Lively switching into that rotation. That's the only change there. And there is some noise with possessions. The real nugget of insight here that I think is really interesting to note, and something you probably subliminally realized, was that with the starting unit of the Dallas Mavericks in the playoffs last year, including Gafford versus Lively, the rim defense in terms of effective field goal percentage was appreciably better with Gafford in the lineup in the rim and short mid-range regions of the floor. Guys were not able to effectively finish nearly as well with Gafford being the rim protector than Lively. Maybe a little counterintuitive, but I don't think it should be. Thinking about Gafford's experience being a lone rim protector in Washington used him very, very traditionally, and you even see that with his pretty shaky playmaking out of hit-ahead passes and things like that. Just a very good nose for the ball, defending the rim. Very, very good high-flying vertical defender, if you will. But completely the opposite, the farther and farther you go away from the rim as far as defensive effective field goal percentage goes. In the long mid-range, overall three-point shooting, including corners and non-corner three-point shooting, tremendously better defensive potency for the starting unit of the Mavericks with Lively instead of Gafford. Very much struggles defending in space, and you think about that in the context of Oklahoma City, Boston Celtics, 5-out infrastructure. They want to take your traditional big, have him have more space to cover when guys actually take advantage of the additional spacing, get to the rim, etc. And then also, sort of drag them around outside and get some of their guys, Chet, Porzingis, Horford, whoever, actual movement and shots from the outside. And I think that's why we ultimately saw an increase in Lively's minutes overall throughout the course of the playoffs, and especially in that Oklahoma City and Boston series. Lively's just much, much better at covering more space more quickly and more effectively in terms of contests. And it shows up in the opponent's shooting percentage, not only in just being better than Gafford, but when Lively was on the floor, the Mavericks were in the 95th percentile in defending all three-point attempts and in the 100th percentile in defending opponent mid-range shooting attempts. So it's not even like a significant jump from, Lively is just overall a better defender, he needs to start, he's much more potent, he can do all these things than Gafford. He is much more effective and proved that he was in and against 5-out systems like Oklahoma City and Boston because of his instincts, ability to patrol the baseline, close out effectively without fouling, all those things. But when it comes to actual rim field goal deterrence and protecting the basket, right, short mid-range or rim, Gafford is far, far better than Lively, or at least he was last playoffs. So overall takeaways from that is, one, there's a double click into where, why, and how potentially Lively versus Gafford possess their own unique strengths that Jason Kidd has at his disposal, but also signals some maybe confounding or confusing shortcomings from Lively when you think about his reach and athleticism, particularly at defending the rim. It definitely feels like Lively can make strides there for sure. But the ability, of course, with increased space, guard skills, all of the homogeneity in teams like Oklahoma City and Boston, who are only going to get better. We'll see if Phoenix actually decides to take threes this year. It's increasingly looking like Lively may be better situated to defend as a starting big against these types of matchups. As we all know, though, the punchline that Kidd even said in his postgames, having these two guys to kind of hand off minutes allows more of that hockey-style mentality of shorter minutes, but balls to the wall when you're on the court. And I think that you obviously saw in the overall team level defensive metrics here, that scheme proved very, very effective. And I'll expand on that now. Let's take a look at playoff shooting. Looking at the playoff shooting more broadly now, their offensive efficiency at the rim was 4th of all playoff and play-in teams, 11th in the mid-range, 10th from the three-point line. Their frequency was 13th at the rim, 8th from the mid-range, and then 9th from the three-point line. No-brainer inside there. Being 4th most efficient at the rim is definitely a testament to Luka Doncic, the lob threats. It feels like Lob City 2.0, which I'm shocked that I don't see as many people kind of calling out here. I know Chris Paul and Blake Griffin and DJ all had that big thing, and it was really fun because no one gave a shit about the Clippers before then. This is kind of the modern Lob City, and I think more people should be appreciating it as such. Of all playoff play-in teams being 4th in efficiency, again, these are rim-running bigs that are going to get great passes with Luka's ability to freeze the defense, so they have to process for an extra half second, read his eyes or try to, as well as shoulders and body, to see if he's going to actually shoot, take it in, or get the lob. We saw a ton of great highlights there, excellent tempo, and being that maestro of operating in that short mid-range, freezing the defender, and getting his bigs basically uncontested dunks and lay-ins at the rim. The only other thing I will say is being exactly middle of the pack from the three-point line as far as efficiency and basically frequency is a trend that clashes with some of the other great teams. Even with some of these new acquisitions that Dallas has brought in, a lot of them had the defensive upside that management and the coaching staff recognized they needed to magnify and amplify to have sustainable opportunity to come out on top of some of these great two-way teams. But fundamentally on offense, the most important indicator to be tracking for Dallas continues to be their three-point efficiency. Why? Because everything that Dallas does is orchestrated around the classic Luka Doncic chokehold of, I'm doing a pick and roll, and you are going to show me how you're going to defend me as I come around under, over screens. Is the big in a drop? Are they coming up to the level? Where are my passes going to be? That sort of stuff. But of course, he's a generational passer as well. Depending on how you want to guard him, he is going to make the right pass every single time. And to maximize the pressure that he presents to help his overall team, he is always trying to get closer and closer to the rim to draw additional attention to open up easy lobs or kick out passes from three. In order to get to that mid-range region, he cannot have what happened in Boston happen every single time. Derrick Jones Jr. and PJ Washington extremely shaky from the outside perimeter, which allowed Boston's perimeter defenders to not double team, but they're just loading up in the gaps and challenging Luka to trust Derrick Jones to knock in these easy shots because they're just not going to let Luka waltz right into that short mid-range area and armbar them that easily, because that's where he's the most dangerous. And so in order to prevent the defense from sitting over there in the gaps, sagging off of his teammates, they had to make perimeter shots to establish that they were potent and open up more space to drive for Luka. All of that to say, 10th of all playoff teams in three-point efficiency and being ninth in frequency is something that I truly, truly think needs to take a step up. And of course, we're going to touch on Klay Thompson as we forecast into the next year. But point being, that three-point percentage was not where it needed to be, especially given the frequency. And a lot of that had to do with personnel and defensive schemes adjusting to said personnel to make it even harder for Luka to get or generate the shots that he wanted. Defense now. Their efficiency at the rim was 8th, mid-range was 3rd, three-point was 9th, frequency was 9th at the rim, mid-range was 10th, three-point arc was 15th. Having defensive efficiencies above the median 10th place is great across the board. I think the only real big standout to me is the efficiency in the mid-range being 3rd of all playoff teams is really, really impressive, especially because I think I would have defaulted to Oklahoma City or Boston because of their just very physical, heady, defensively talented perimeter guards that they would just throw on your Lukas, your Halliburtons, your Brunsons, your guys who are trying to get into the arc outside in. And therefore, these guys are going to be prepared not only to slow them down at the point of attack and try their best to make it harder from the jump, but the entire team is going to be on high alert to bring the help needed and thwart the mid-range. So the only thing that really stuck out to me was finishing up 3rd in mid-range defensive field goal percentage is really, really impressive, primarily because we're talking about a Luka Doncic, Kyrie, and Derrick Jones Jr. top 3 here for most of the possessions. Huge shout out to Derrick Jones. I think this obviously signals a lot of his not even latent impact, just observable impact on your superstars they played against that love to operate in that mid-range. Of course, we're talking about Paul George, Shai Gilgeous, Jalen Williams, Anthony Edwards, that kind of stuff. And to ultimately finish 3rd is just really, really impactful because, of course, he was their best point of attack defender, really a specialist, and that is just really, really impressive. Again, looking at it through the lens of who they were playing against. I think Shai led the entire playoffs in mid-range field goal attempts or something like that, and Jalen Williams is not far from him. And so really just huge testament to him, and he really did a lot of wonders to him, which, of course, signals some interesting questions about next season with him joining the Clippers. So synthesizing these past playoffs here, the first thing I just want to call out pretty broadly is that the Mavs had a really tough path to the NBA Finals. And I guess I'm just trying to give accolades where they're due, particularly just because I obviously think a lot about these things as far as schematics, opponents, play styles, matchups. But to go through the Clippers, which is a bit of a cover the sheet and move on with, it took them 6 games, and of course they were adjusting to the playoffs, I think, with their roster that I'll touch on in a second here. But to move through Oklahoma City, Minnesota, and then to play Boston, probably the 3 best defensive teams besides Orlando and Cleveland, at least my assessment and faith into the playoff settings at higher and higher levels. The Oklahoma City Thunder, top 5 in defense in the regular season, and in the postseason, the Minnesota Timberwolves finishing obviously took a pretty steep drop off with their games against Denver and then, of course, Dallas running out of steam, but then Boston as well. I just feel like the schematic opponents as far as defensive structures that Luka and the rest of this team had to figure out and tinker with and rally back against and finish off is just very, very admirable. And it's just a testament to, obviously, Luka's greatness, him being the center focal point of a team able to make this incredible run. We've seen it pretty close before, of course. I just really think he deserves some serious accolades, and I know he even had that weird leg bleeding thing that I don't know if anybody got to the bottom of. That was gross, and I just kind of want to know what it is. But You have the extremely quick, handsy, physical defenders of Boston and Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City, of course, everyone is like 22 years old, so they are just going to run and run and run at you and claw at you, and of course, up the level of physicality, both because of the playoffs and, in my opinion, some of the shorter guards get away with more contact type of thing. Again, not a huge deal. I'm just pointing things out. But then, of course, Minnesota, double big lineups, playing and puppeteering Karl Anthony Towns and Gobert out with space with PJ Washington, and reading, of course, Jaden McDaniels, who basically couldn't even really deter him. And you hear Jaden McDaniels in some of these post-game interviews with, yeah, I was playing the same defense. In some games, the dude is just making shots. I didn't change anything. And then, of course, some of the late-game heroics, right, with the step back and Rudy Gobert's face, and he's freaking out like an absolute psychopath, and that's great. Kyrie, of course, is something I'll double-click onto, but having that co-star there, secondary facilitator, carrying the offensive load for stretches. When they acquired him, of course, there was not a ton of stock and buzz, and the stock price of Kyrie Irving LLC was not very high to begin with, and really employed him, again, offensively very, very well. I think culturally I'll get into as well. He was an incredible leader, mouthpiece, guide for a lot of these inexperienced recent acquisitions, which leads me to the second part. This team only had 6 months to gel. You had 2 starters joining the roster with only about 4 or 5 months to gel together before the postseason started. And neither Washington or Gafford had playoff experience to begin with, coming from Charlotte and Washington. And being able to galvanize and maximize what their strengths were in that short of a period of time, as well as Derek Lively, of course, a rookie who, I mean, in all honesty, could have been made in a petri dish for Luka's dream partner for maximizing this Luka ball offensive scheme. It was just very, very impressive to me. Like, 3 out of their top 6 players in minutes didn't have any playoff experience. One of them was a rookie. All of them seem to really, really fall in love with this team and really also be invested in, right? Role specialization and maximization, Gafford's rim protection, rim finishing, Lively being able to space the perimeter defensively a lot better, get to prove and showcase some secondary facilitation skills on hit-ahead passes. PJ Washington leading the Mavs in scoring in one of those games against Oklahoma City. He was the second leading scorer, I believe, in 1 or 2 of the other ones too. Trusting him to knock down those cross-court kickouts because Oklahoma City was selling out to Luka when he got close to the rim. Like, all of these things to me are just like building blocks and indicators of maximization of teammates from a style of play that is orbiting and central to a single focal point player in Luka Doncic is just really incredible to me. I'm not trying to say better or worse, but we see maximization from a roster perspective for Denver, for example, where they had years of reps and close games and tight playoff performances and falling short and all of those things. But Luka had 4 or 5 months to take these guys without any playoff experience. Both of them still very, very young. PJ 24, Gafford 24, Lively 19, 20, being a rookie, and being able to cultivate all of that success, again, through maybe the 3 best remaining defensive teams in the playoffs at that time. I'm sorry, Orlando. I know they were going to be really good. Maybe I should have just said overall potency, but you get what I'm saying. 3 of the top 4 defensive teams in the league, and go through Oklahoma City's youth and incredible coaching and hunger and all of that. Minnesota case in point, but their defensive strengths were much more oriented closer to the rim, leading to more adjustments having to be made. And then, of course, Boston being relatively potent basically everywhere, but of course, especially on the perimeter with its incredible defensive potency with its perimeter players. The strength of opponent, the lack of time to gel and have a runway to optimize each other's skills and roles within their system, offensively and defensively, is just very, very impressive, and I think deserves a genuine nod, primarily to, of course, Luka Doncic, but which leads us to the second point I want to make here, which is Kyrie for the Sherpa MVP. Yes, I made that up, but you're going to understand what I mean. I truly believe that Kyrie Irving may have had the biggest impact on his team's success this past postseason, and it's primarily in ways that expand far beyond the actual box score. I think the post-game interviews do it the most justice, but I'm going to synthesize them for you. Outstanding playoff leadership for, of course, Luka going this deep in the postseason to begin with, but especially the inexperienced guys on the roster coming over at the trade deadline, Lively being a rookie. Extremely, extremely heartfelt and authentic and open and real, saying he made sure to make himself vulnerable and setting an example of that for the team to be able to more effectively help each other. Keeping Luka, of course, under wraps with regards to the refs and freaking out about missed calls or calls against him, which I know had a lot of buzz around it. He finishes, I still believe, with the most technical fouls in the regular season. That, of course, was going to be a hot topic of conversation, and if you remember, the broadcasters were even joking around about that. Luka giving accolades primarily to Kyrie for helping him understand and recognize the gift of getting to play this game professionally and, of course, succeed at some of the highest levels for his age demographic in the history of the league, allowing him to reframe his thought processes around the refereeing and calls and things that would undermine his focus to be a better player and leader for the rest of the Mavericks franchise. Jason Kidd as well. Kyrie's outstanding impact in lifting up, galvanizing, and encouraging some of the other guys, particularly later in the postseason when shots weren't falling, level of competition is only getting higher and higher. For a lot of guys without direct experience in those situations, being virtually everything you could ever want from a veteran presence and role model on that team. Of course, as we'll get into, some of his own on-court production, actually playing the game, did of course suffer, but all the way leading up to those moments and including the post-game conferences again, and letting this guy kind of spew out stuff, which a lot of people will roll their eyes at and not really care a lot about. I don't know what kind of ayahuasca this guy was smoking these last couple years, but he seems so at peace and hellbent on encouraging the younger generation and wanting them to be successful, playing the team first play style of conceding shots in offensive flair until the second half of games, prioritizing getting the others involved from the jump to ultimately help the Mavericks' potency and sustainability throughout these games and series. Just all of the building blocks that I genuinely think teams need to be successful in today's NBA, and particularly with a Mavs roster that is so young and was so inexperienced, being led by a 24, 25-year-old in Luka, absolutely needed that presence there. And I think it really, really paid dividends for that team. Probably primarily in that Oklahoma City series, which again, almost exactly 0-point differential and a matchup that probably could have went either way. save for a couple missed shots here and there. Ultimately, why I call Kyrie the Sherpa MVP, kind of shepherding these younger, less experienced guys to be confident and capable in these huge moments, as well as helping Luka approach and view his game, production, success, whistle how he should to best help the team's ultimate success. Next is just a fun observation that I just think is kind of funny. I don't think it's a secret that the Mavericks had the top-rated defense after the All-Star break last year, bringing in Washington and Gafford. Obviously, that last third of the season, notoriously, guys are resting, guys are tanking, or rather, guys are resting, teams are tanking, maybe not as difficult. Okay, fine. But it translated to the postseason in them ultimately having the 6th best defensive rating in the league, not to mention the 5th best net differential overall throughout the postseason. Just thought this is interesting because it really signals the evolution of the Mavericks play style that we've grown accustomed to seeing in the Luka era, where offense wins games, we're going to bleed defense, but we are going to compensate and then some with our high-powered offense. It's just very, very cool and notable from a team-building, roster-building perspective that the script is kind of flipped now, where investments in exceptional defense while retaining and specializing the guys responsible for the offensive firepower elements has been better refined. But again, they now have a very formidable defensive apparatus to fall back on, even withstanding the playoffs with maybe an experience or talent deficiency against some of these other teams. It's just a bit of a script flip because now their defense is definitely a signature part of their reputation, even including Luka, who makes jokes in post-game interviews about his defense never getting any spotlight and goes on JJ's podcast and is making jokes about it and honestly played his ass off in more than a handful of very, very key moments. And so I just want to give credit there as far as the identity shift while threading the needle of retaining their offensive potency, but magnifying it with a perimeter potent PJ Washington and even greater rim running vertical threat Daniel Gafford, as well as Lively, of course. And then, of course, Klay Thompson now coming in to basically reinforce that offensive model of Luka ball. Are you going to guard me? Are you going to come up to the level of the screen and make me trust the hit-ahead passes? Are you going to drop back and let me put you in jail? To which I will read the last defender for a lob or kick out or whatever. It just feels like it's been very much maximized and specialized, with the common thread being defense matters, which hasn't always been the case. So props to Nico Harrison, Jason Kidd, etc. Double clicking on offense and defense now. I've touched on all these a lot, but the Achilles heel for the Mavericks wound up being their offensive ceiling. So against Boston, you saw their offensive rating fall down to 108 points per possession. They end up averaging the 9th best offense of all playoff and play-in teams, 20 of 115 points per possession. And I think all of us felt that. And there is an infrastructural reason why, and it unfortunately does come down to their infrastructure having requirements that teams like Oklahoma City and Boston just do not. And that is, Dallas only had 2 guys that could put the ball on the floor and initiate. Boston knew that, and so did Oklahoma City. What that meant was Dallas's perimeter potency had to be established to prevent the other team's defense from sagging off and crowding driving lanes making it very, very difficult for Luka and Kyrie to put opposing teams in that prison of how are you going to guard me? Whichever way you do, I'm going to punish you the other way, cross-court passes, lobs, mid-range, whatever. They needed that space and those driving lanes to be more accessible by establishing Derrick Jones and PJ Washington as credible outside threats. Very, very similar to Minnesota with Jaden McDaniels, Karl Anthony Towns, et cetera, and we saw very similar plots for the Mavericks and the Minnesota Timberwolves in the postseason, where they just couldn't get their heads of the snakes into the regions that they really wanted to get to optimize their strengths and ability to punish defenses. And so reducing the level of necessity of that requirement is very important, and it is basically the only method for raising their overall ceiling offensively. Obviously, we'll talk to Klay Thompson in a second, but I just want to draw a contrast to your Oklahoma Cities and Bostons, where you have great homogeneity of guard skills, where virtually everybody can put the ball on the floor to initiate as well as finish. Guys can make outside shots when they are open. They can also attack closeouts and make a second read or a third read or a fifth read. Dallas just didn't have that. And so that leads to my second point now. Luka is confirmed a generational offensive talent, but he may not be optimized from a team-level perspective. Even though he led the entire playoffs in total points, rebounds, and assists, Luka Doncic was unable to carry and drag this team to a title over the Boston Celtics, Timberwolves, Thunder, Clippers. Main points here being, again, we're only talking about offense. First of all, the fact that Luka Doncic collected the most total number of rebounds of any player in the playoffs is pretty remarkable. And I just think it's worth noting, because you think about Dallas's huge rim runners with Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford and boxing guys out and soaking up boards and crashing the offensive glass and yada, yada. That's just really impressive. And yeah, Luka's huge. Say what you want about it. But him being able to invest in defensive rebounding, getting his eyes up, finding guys in transition, starting a break, obviously not all the time because he's not the quickest guy in the world. I just think it's just worth mentioning that this guy's at least able to do it. Now, granted, I'm sure that it is a function somewhat of the classic Russell Westbrook getting the easy uncontested rebounds where the bigs are just boxing out to allow the guard to actually collect it and get the fast break going as fast as possible. I just think it's worth acknowledging and giving a nod to. But to the broader insight of non-optimization is these kinds of performances offensively, points, rebounds, assists, leading in all these categories indicates somewhat to me that we basically found the limit to which Luka Doncic can be air quote relied on. I know Mavs fans probably want to point to Luka's bleeding knee and some of the other things and guys just missing a ton of outside shots. I do think that there's validity to those arguments, but I would argue that that does ultimately feed into deficiencies at a roster or team level basis with Klay Thompson replacing Derrick Jones Jr., allowing defenses to sag into driving lanes, making it even harder for Luka. And this, of course, translates into some of the acquisitions that they got, which I will double click into when I'm forecasting next year. But again, just looking at last year, Luka is generational in his offensive potency and puppeteering and orchestration, but we saw deficiencies from a roster perspective that ultimately, I believe, led to hamstringing their offensive potency that we watched, leaving them with under a 108 offensive rating in that Boston Finals series. Defense, of course, the acquisitions at the trade deadline of Daniel Gafford and PJ Washington. Very, very physical, play bigger than they are, vertical threats, also very agile for their sizes. PJ coming from Charlotte, where at least a couple years back, because they got new acquisitions, actually even got run at the center position, and then, of course, adjusted to be more versatile on the perimeter. These are just extremely versatile and tenacious guys. As I mentioned before with Gafford versus Lively as well, Gafford's rim and short mid-range contests, when viewed through the lens of opponent effective field goal percentages, Gafford was unbelievable at protecting the rim. Of course, struggled mightily when it came to playing against five-out offenses, but you look at teams like Minnesota, even particularly Denver, if they do get matched up with them next year, that tandem of Gafford and Lively, depending on the matchups, is an extremely helpful luxury to have for Jason Kidd. And so, yeah, it's great that they only finished with the 17th best defensive rating in the regular season last year, but then they end up finishing 6th in defensive rating in the playoffs. We're pretty confident at this point in their ability to defend at higher and higher levels of competition and pressure, even with PJ, Gafford, and Lively not having any playoff experience at all. Being able to drive that potent of a defense is an extremely great sign for their potency as they just continue to get more reps together and more time to build chemistry. The last main point here is giving flowers to Derrick Jones, really reviving his own value and career in a lot of ways on this team, being an utter animal as a point of attack defender, defending 1 through 3, even 4 sometimes in the postseason. Granted, he did have some experience back when he was on Chicago, but this was, you are the elite primary defensive assignment on literally the greatest players in the league, and we are relying on you to slow them down. We're talking about Paul George, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Jalen Williams, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown. I think that this was most important in that Oklahoma City series where you had Oklahoma City's penchant for mid-range shooting, their biggest differentiator from Boston, who is very, very wed to the D'Antoni, it's a layup or it's a 3 analytics mode of offense. But Mark Daigneault, SGA, Jalen Williams, very much being okay with pulling that release valve in the mid-range, trusting their guys to make tough shots from there, did an outstanding job. Even just looking at overall the Mavericks finishing with the 3rd best mid-range defense in terms of effective field goal percentage of all 20 playoff and play-in teams. Personally, I attribute the vast majority of that to none other than Derrick Jones Jr. And then the super duper last point about that is I'm very confident that he provided that defensive role modeling for this team that really, really cultivated a formidable defensive identity with a lot of new guys in their top 6 or 7, as well as inexperienced guys when it came to the playoffs. Having a guy very low maintenance on offense, but doing all of that dirty work on the toughest assignments has got to be an incredible source of role modeling for your PJs and Lively's and Gaffords. So great work by him. So synthesizing everything now and looking at ceiling factors for the Mavericks in 2025, when we think about the playoffs, the first thing, of course, is looking at the offseason changes, acquisitions, and losses. Of course, they lose Derrick Jones Jr., incredible point of attack defender, very important piece of that team last year in their run. Josh Green, Tim Hardaway Jr., added Klay Thompson and Quentin Grimes from Detroit. of course, they lose Derrick Jones Jr., Josh Green, Tim Hardaway Jr., and then add Klay Thompson and Quentin Grimes from Detroit. Very quickly about them, Derrick Jones Jr., of course, their best point of attack defender, all the reasons I just outlined. Incredible defensive role model, doing dirty work, low maintenance on offense. Obviously had offensive deficiencies that, while of course it's unfair to put a majority of the blame for Dallas's offensive shortcomings in that Boston final series, I think a lot of it does unfortunately rest on his end, but you think back on and reflect on all of the insane defensive assignments that he had and the team's overall defensive metrics, particularly in the mid-range, that I would attribute to him, especially thinking about SGA, J-Dub, Paul George, etc. Josh Green, energy guy, always loves to run a million miles an hour, found his outside shooting a little bit too late in that Boston final series, but I always really liked him as a hustle guy and, of course, a little bit undersized, but the shaky shooting seemed to have run its course. That would be my vision and explanation for that, but maybe it's just because of their physical profiles being so similar, but I view Quentin Grimes and Josh Green to be basically the same person, except Quentin Grimes is, I think, a smidge younger and a little bit bigger of an offensive upside when it comes to the outside shooting. Has yet to get a meaningful shot at contributing meaningful value on a playoff team, so we will see there. Tim Hardaway Jr., of course, I mean, that contract and really his entire essence on that roster, I think it really run its course and it makes complete sense. I don't want to be mean about this guy because he has had incredible stints and flashes of greatness in his offensive game. It is slightly disappointing that the defense particularly seemed to not ever fully manifest itself, especially in a system with Dallas's revamped roster now, with PJ Washington as well as Klay Thompson, which I'll pivot to, but Tim Hardaway Jr.'s outside shooting potency, his flammability to just start not missing any outside shots, as well as his defensive deficiencies seem to have been pretty well replaced by what at least we think we're getting from Klay Thompson. Klay, of course, coming over from Golden State, from that really depressing exit and the entire concluding plot of that with going 0 for 10 in their play-in game against Sacramento, soaking everything in the stadium afterwards, and all of the back and forth with his extension and being relegated to come off the bench during the season for Brandon Podziemski and all of those things. It seemed like the feelings were really, really hurt. So I'm really excited about Klay Thompson, in a nutshell, getting the fuck out of San Francisco, because all of the ghosts chasing him and him chasing his own, trying to be the player that he once was, probably hamstrung by literal physical constraints, given he had 2 previously career-ending injuries in succession, still managed to be averaging 19 points a game or so on over 40% three-point shooting, is going to, in my opinion, provide Tim Hardaway Jr.'s offensive spark plug while presumably being able to tread water defensively, even at his age and with his physical deficiencies, potential ones. Just makes a lot of sense for the Mavs and especially himself, because he needed a change of scenery. I'm really sorry about the boat. I guess Dallas has some lakes, but you also have made hundreds of millions of dollars in your very well accoladed career, and I'm assuming you can figure out a way to get to the boat some other way. I just want to say I'm happy for Klay that he got the hell out of there. Pivoting now to the ceiling factors for 2025, what do we want to cover for the Dallas Mavericks? Well, number one is, of course, the guard wing point of attack defense. Losing Derrick Jones Jr., taking the toughest defensive assignments, Shai Gilgeous, Paul George, Jason Tatum, all of those things is going to be a pretty impactful loss, especially when you look at the team level defensive metrics that the Mavericks were able to put on this past postseason. So it's definitely going to be a thing where Klay is going to have to prove that he can drive enough defensive value to not bleed more than he is contributing offensively. I think most of us understood Dallas's ceiling as a postseason team last year was determined primarily by its offensive shortcomings, not its defensive one. It winds up, in my mind, being the most important factor in gauging Dallas's postseason success is Klay's sustainability in guarding some of the best guard or wing opponents in the entire NBA. The other thing I want to point out, though, is that fatigue might be offset slightly by the fact that he won't be running all over the court like he's back in Golden State with their system of pace and space and running to catch the ball just to give it up and continue doing that. Hopefully that will preserve some of his energy and sustainability from a physical standpoint to drive and up his value defensively. He is primarily going to be a spot-up guy similar to Derrick Jones, I would imagine, drawing that help defense and opening up driving lanes for Kyrie and Luka, but also just possessing far more gravity and actual shooting potency than Derrick Jones. Hopefully that lack of movement will not only free up more energy for him to expend defensively in some of these tough matchups, but it'll ultimately help him sustain his actual career as an NBA player who had suffered some of the most horrific injuries imaginable for NBA players. So ultimately, it's a trade-off. Klay clearly still possesses some of the best, most potent outside shooting gravity in the entire league, which is exactly what Dallas needs and exactly what he said in his press introduction about why he ended up choosing Dallas as his next team as opposed to the Lakers, for example, or going back with the Warriors for potentially even more money. I think it had a lot to do with the fact that this sort of role is going to let him score a lot of points while also contributing to a winning team. But I also believe that the Mavericks gave him that ultimatum, essentially, if he wanted to join, of you are going to get to make a lot of open shots with less movement, but you need to exchange it for rabid defense. That is where we primarily need that energy and juice to shine. Everyone knows that you can shoot, and more often than not, your value is going to manifest in simply your gravity from the outside in helping Luka and Kyrie get downhill. So if you can conserve the energy there to expend it defensively, that is what we're looking for. And I feel pretty decent about that, honestly. And I feel pretty good about that, particularly in the playoffs. When you think about the psychology games of closing out very abruptly, not to mention Klay's necessitated ability and skill development in that secondary playmaking position after attacking closeouts and making those next reads, another layer that Dallas was lacking from its Derrick Jones and PJ Washington's in the postseason, where they could attack closeouts, not with amazing rim finishing abilities, but just like your Oklahoma Cities and Bostons, you need to be able to make those extra reads as well. Sharpening the knife, upping the shot quality to ultimately up and boost the overall shooting potency and threat level distributed across the court necessitates multiple facilitators as well as play finishers. And I think Klay will do an outstanding job of that. I really do, given the lack of running and everything else. Next is the Quentin Grimes three-point efficiency. It is no secret that, of course, if Klay Thompson gets winded or just generally speaking gets subbed out, it is a pretty good chance that Quentin Grimes is going to get some run coming in and replacing him, which, like I said when I talked about Dallas's offensive apparatus and requirements, they can simply not afford, especially in matchups like Oklahoma City and Boston, to have their driving gaps closed off because guys aren't caring about Grimes' outside perimeter potency. And especially with the defensive fatigue that Klay probably is going to endure, and we'll see how well he holds up. But Grimes seems pretty tenacious, very similar to Josh Green in that respect, and I kind of feel like it's going to be relatively able to hold water. But most importantly is the entire chokehold model of Luka and Kyrie being able to get to those regions on the floor where they are most comfortable and dangerous that require, again, its perimeter to establish it is a threat as well. So pending Klay's sustainability on the court, defending other teams' great wings and guards, Grimes is just going to have to be able to demonstrate his outside shooting potency in the same ways that Derrick Jones and Klay Thompson, well, Klay won't have to prove it, will need to. And then last but not least, thinking primarily about the playoffs next year, is the point around Kyrie Irving's consistency. Let me just start off by listing out some of his averages for each of their playoff rounds this past year, just to highlight the schematic and strategic deficiencies he has against different strategic and schematic opponents in each round of last year's playoffs. Clippers, 27, 6, and 5, 65% true shooting. Oklahoma City, 16, 2, and 6, 53% true shooting. Minnesota, 27, 4, and 5, 59% true shooting. Boston, 23 and 5 at 48% true shooting. It's that Oklahoma City and Boston are by far the best situated to shut off Kyrie's potency by offering very tenacious guard and perimeter defenders that can get up into him and limit his whole chaos agent, crazy handle, transition finishing type of production style that he has. A lot of times, Kyrie benefits from the other team having a very primary perimeter defender like Jaden McDaniels, having his hands full with Luka Doncic, and then him benefiting from that and all the attention coming off of Luka. However, when you play teams, again, like Oklahoma City, I don't know why I just feel like deep in my testes, they're going to play each other again next year. I just really, really believe it. Kyrie only averaged 16 points. Now, granted, that is a testament to PJ Washington exploding from that opposite weak side corner from three because OKC was selling out to close off Luka Doncic from getting to his short mid-range chokehold region of the floor. Now that we forecast the addition of Hardenstein in that lineup where you have a 7'1" guy playing the 4 in Chet, guarding PJ Washington, now with iHeart disrupting the rim play between Gafford, Lively, and of course Luka, Kyrie, or whatever, reading the defense, making them commit. Not only is Hardenstein pretty effective as a rim defender to begin with, but it is not necessarily like they're going to have to send Lou Dort flying over at Luka to sell out to try and somewhat stop Luka's incredible size and finishing ability at the rim because everyone besides Chet is very undersized, right? That's not even mentioning the Alex Caruso piece of this if they decide to run him out in their closing lineups. Like, it is just going to require Kyrie to produce more than he did in that series last year. And then, of course, we all know what happened in Boston with the best defensive backcourt in the entire NBA, Drew Holiday, Derek White. He really struggles in those environments. So if he's playing teams with two or more very, very potent defensive players that can come out on the wing and guard 1 through 3s, he proved to definitely struggle quite a bit. And that is going to be something that, again, PJ Washington was able to buoy them through that Oklahoma City series, but of course, Boston was not able to do so. So that is why I'm going to be monitoring Kyrie's consistency in those types of matchups, because it's going to be a very helpful indicator for how these things might work come the postseason. Secondarily, his whole pace setting and not really scoring in the first half against Oklahoma City, preferring to get PJ Washington and Derrick Jones into rhythm and going offensively, but then coming alive in the second half, very much caught on to Oklahoma City and Boston throughout those series. Again, you're playing the same team every single game with really not that much time in between. Those sorts of schemes are going to have to be employed a little more sporadically or unexpectedly to maximize, again, Kyrie, because he needs to also establish his own potency, probably, especially in a potential Boston matchup again. The good thing is, though, of course, acquiring Klay Thompson probably unlocks more of that driving lane for him to get downhill, similar to Luka. We'll see what he's able to do. Obviously, again, Boston retained everybody. Oklahoma City only got better at its rim and wing defensive positions. So I just say all this to say, yes, it's important to have the gravity of Klay Thompson, but the actual opposing defensive potency he'll have to handle and outmaneuver and adjust to is either the exact same or better. Definitely something I will be watching as they come along. And I'll also be very interested to monitor what Klay is able to bring as that secondary initiator off of Luka as well, to maybe even get Kyrie some more open looks from the perimeter, because everybody knows, I mean, a wide open Kyrie Irving on the wing, or even with 2 or 3 steps, is basically a 50-50 make at that point. He's one of the best outside shooters with uncontested looks in the playoffs that the league currently has. So Kyrie and Klay really dancing and tangoing together, leveraging both of their abilities to initiate and play make with each other off of this incredible focal point of Luka Doncic. Being a generational scorer and facilitator and all that gravity is just going to be really, really interesting to see. Hopefully they can harmonize and synergize so that they get to a place that's greater than the sum of their parts. But what we just saw last year is just something that I think needs to be acknowledged. So the Mavericks are going to be awesome this regular season. There's absolutely no denying it. I think their wins right now are 50.5 games. I personally would take the over, primarily because more injection of offensive talent through Klay Thompson should alleviate some of that physical burden on Luka, Kyrie during the regular season. The only way I could see them getting under is with relatively sizable injuries or just absences from Kyrie or Luka. And so for that reason, I would take the over. I have their seed as actually second or third, just because I really, really think that the Mavericks want the coming out party that the Thunder had last year, with maybe not gunning, right, for a top 1 or 2 seed, but they are going to want we have arrived, we have actually had a training camp, time to gel with our new acquisitions that we were so successful with last postseason. Come and get us. You know, we went to the finals. We've got a chip on our shoulder. We got out of the Western Conference last year. Again, more time to develop that chemistry and offensive dexterity that they have with PJ and now Klay Thompson. I just have a hard time seeing them not at least win 50 games. I would take the over. I have their floor as a second round and then their ceiling as a title. Pretty self-explanatory. At this point, you can probably just pencil in for a lot of these Western Conference titans that their floor has to be about the second round of the playoffs. Maybe that's not the most helpful way to phrase it then, I'm just realizing, but whatever. If I were Jason Kidd and the Mavericks, the Oklahoma City Thunder is by far the biggest threat to them, simply because of their perimeter defensive potency and the fact that they are now really relying on Klay Thompson to slot into that Derrick Jones Jr. role as Shai Gilgeous, 26-year-old Shai Gilgeous, 22-year-old Jalen Williams are only going to get better and more confident, particularly in taking advantage of the mid-range in matchups. And so Oklahoma City, I think, is probably their biggest threat and should be their biggest threat come the postseason. And then, of course, Boston as well. But to their credit, they were able to put themselves in a position, get some experience very deep in the postseason, so early into the pretty close to final construction of this roster. And there is absolutely a viable pathway for them to get back to the finals and really, really take the Celtics absolutely down to the wire, provided the Klay Thompson offensive synergy is there as well as the defensive potency. I actually would fear the Celtics less than the Thunder just because of their turnover driving abilities, their youth, and of course the health concerns coming off of that with Porzingis, Al Horford, etc. There you have it, guys. Thank you all so much again for watching, and until next time.